This is a University of Otago podcast.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to this memorial peace lecture in the name of Dunedin peacemaker Archibald Baxter. My name's Alan Jackson, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be Secretary of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust, which remembers the stance of local man Archie Baxter and several others who resisted the bullying tactics of the army establishment 100 years ago. Archie, as most of you know, refused to don a military uniform or take up weapons to kill another person, for which he was tortured. This is the third annual peace lecture, which is part of Archie's memorial. There will be a physical monument at the junction of George Street and Albany Street, and later in October, the Trust expects to have the designs from the company that are doing the work, that is Baxter Associates, no relation to Archie, who are based in Queenstown. And I hope that we'll be able to put drawings in the Otago Daily Times when we get them, the finished plans. Now, we're absolutely delighted that Kevin Clements is able to give the lecture this year. He, as I'm sure most of you do know, is the director of the National Peace and Conflict Studies Department at the University of Otago. It's based at the university, but this is not simply a university department, it's the National Centre. Now, simply to say, by way of introduction, that Prof. Clements had a sabbatical year from June 2015 until June this year. In 2015, he gave 2 presentations at the International Peace Research Association in Turkey. And later, he attended the last meeting of the East Asian Peace Research Project at Uppsala in Sweden. And then in Stockholm, he gave a lecture on building peace in Northeast Asia. And during his sabbatical study time, he was based at the University of Kent in southern England, and he gave lectures around England at Oxford, at Manchester, at King's College London, at York, and of course at Kent. During that same sabbatical year, he presented a paper on pacifism to the International Studies Association in Georgia, United States, and he gave 2 guest lectures at Winter College in Pennsylvania. He also gave lectures in Tokyo, Kansai, and Kyoto, Japan, on dealing with painful history to build a peaceful present. And last week, he returned from facilitating a workshop with Muslim scholars and activists on non-violent Muslim responses to violent extremism. And this was held in Penang, Malaysia. And so you can see that the influence of the New Zealand National Peace and Conflict Studies Centre is considerably worldwide. And it's no wonder that Prof. Clements was voted New Zealand Peacemaker of the Year in 2014. So please welcome Kevin to deliver this year's lecture. Thank you.
Ena mana, ena rio, ena haifa, tena koutou, tena koutou, tena koutou katoa. Am I coming through all right on the, can you hear me all right? Good. The person we're honouring tonight, as Alan has already said, was Archibald Baxter, and you can he was the father of one of New Zealand's best-known poets, and he was the husband of Millicent Baxter, who was one of New Zealand's first women graduates. And you can tell from his eyes there that he was a man of steely resolve, but he was a rabbiter and a farmer from Brighton who said when he was called up in 1917, I'm not going to fight this stupid war. I'm going to kind of resist this war, and I'm going to disobey authority. And in doing so, he and the 14 others who joined him and other conscientious objectors that have existed in New Zealand established a tradition whereby we didn't have to obey the state whenever it issued the call, and gave a space for the expression of individual autonomy on matters of conscience. This is a photograph of New Zealand soldiers at the Somme in 1916, 100 years ago today. That battle was still raging, even as we speak 100 years ago. And I describe it as state-initiated slaughter. At the end of 4.5 months fighting, up to 1.2 million men on both sides had been killed or wounded in 4.5 months. 8,500 casualties for each of the 141 days of conflict, but some days were worse than the others. The opening day of the offensive, 1 July 1916, in which the New Zealand Division took part, was arguably the worst day in British military history. 19,000 men were killed and another 38,000 wounded. By the end of the campaign on the 18th of November 1916, the Allies had advanced 10 kilometers into German-held territory, about the distance a fit young man could run in an hour. It was in response to that slaughter and in response to the kind of absolute stupidity and futility of that war that Archibald Baxter and the other 13 who joined him protested and said there must be some other ways. And for that, as Alan's already said, wrong machine, Archie got field punishment number 1, which meant that he and a number of others were strapped up on poles. This wasn't a punishment dedicated to conscientious objectors, incidentally. It was a punishment for anybody in the military who disobeyed authority. But the conscientious objectors had a particular kind of deep application of it. You were supposed to be rested after 8 hours. Archie Baxter spent between 9 and 12 hours strapped up there on the front lines in a position which meant that his legs went numb, his arms went numb, and he sort of lost consciousness at different stages. But he, along with others, resisted to the very end. They never put on the uniform. They never took up their guns. And even though it precipitated a mental breakdown on his part, it was an act of solemn and even graceful resistance to authority. And out of that, Archie wrote his classic anti-war text, We Will Not Cease, and gave us all an injunction really to begin thinking very carefully about which wars we would and wouldn't support and why, and gave all of us, I think, the courage to say no whenever the state issued the call for whatever reason. And I think that this is a very important position to have taken. I mean, it seems to me that the position of an absolute conscientious objector, one who's willing to resist all efforts to put on the uniform and to fight in the nation's cause, is extraordinarily important in terms of creating a kind of a vocational tension for those that hear a different drum and respond to the nation's call. And so I always see conscientious objectors as making a vocational commitment to an alternative reality, to another way of beginning to resolve these problems. So what might you ask is the connection between Archie Baxter and the current present? The connection is that state systems all around the world continue to ask men and women to take up arms in behalf of political causes. And one of the things which I think is also happening at this particular juncture in the global narrative is that we're seeing all around us examples of the kinds of dynamics, not exactly the same, but similar dynamics to those that fueled the First World War. Brexit, for me, was a kind of the first nightmare of this year. The first indication that, nationalism was rearing its head again. German responses to refugee migration into Europe and a desire to pull up the drawbridge in many other European countries against refugees and migrants is another example of this movement towards a nationalism, a kind of a nationalism behind walls and a nationalism behind the channel and all the other moats that exist. So it seems to me that we're existing in a dystopian present that is different from, but has echoes of, the present that preceded the First World War and possibly more appropriately the Second World War. And we're confronted by challenges which can't be resolved by states alone. All of the challenges the world is confronting require collaborative problem solving, which is a distinct premium at the moment. And that we can't respond to climate change behind national boundaries. It just won't work. It requires a global response to fix the challenges of global change. Negative globalization, which sees some parts of the world becoming extraordinarily rich at the expense of other parts of the world, also can't continue and require global solutions. War itself requires global solutions, and the refugees that come about as a consequence of war require that. Economic vulnerability requires cooperation rather than competition. Social and environmental precarity and high levels of alienation from political processes and political institutions might be kind of addressed temporarily by a retreat into xenophobic populism and nationalism. But I would argue very strongly that in the long term and even in the medium term, they're going to generate the pathologies which kind of lay behind a lot of the competition and the violence of the First and Second World Wars. All of these challenges are driving in a very paradoxical and odd way, are driving state dysfunction and paralysis and generating higher levels of political extremism than I can ever recall in my lifetime. It's a very short lifetime. It's just 70 years of living, but even so, I can't recall a moment when nationalism was so fervent and when populism and extremism and xenophobia were so fervent. We're confronted also by a relatively new phenomenon, the popularity of celebrity, and I would argue, neo-fascist political leaders, Trump, Duterte, Putin, el-Sisi. There are some progressive populist leaders, but these are a minority and not very celebrities. And these challenges are not north-south problems anymore. They're global problems, and they're going to have an impact on all of us. Just to take global inequality, a major driver of grievance and violence. A research paper by Oxfam showed that the richest 1% of the world have seen their share of global wealth increase from 44% in 2009 to 48% in 2014, and at this rate will be more than 50% at the end of this year. Members of the global elite had an average wealth of $2.7 million per adult in 2014. Of the remaining 52% of global wealth, almost all, 46%, is owned by the rest of the richest fifth of the world's population, and the other 80% share just 5.5% with an average wealth of $3,851 per adult, or 1/700th of the average wealth of the 1%. Those are extremes which would have made the King of France blush with gratification prior to the French Revolution. They're more extreme than the extremes that precipitated the revolutionary movements of Europe in the 19th century. And they're producing political pathologies. And I just sort of want to go through some of these. I mean, the first is a politics of domination. State systems everywhere are becoming more and more dominant and are claiming more and more responsibility over our lives in all sorts of different ways. To just take one example of that, the issue of surveillance, privacy, and an erosion of civil liberty in response to the war on terror. I can't recall a moment in history when we've been subject to such extreme and massive state surveillance of citizens all around the world. We're subject to data collections, we're subject to human intelligence gathering, we're subject to social media intelligence. We're subject to all kinds of surveillance that take place when you submit your passport or apply for visas. All of the Five Eyes countries, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, the US, and New Zealand, are sharing all of our banking information. There's a closed-circuit television camera on almost every street in the country and certainly in every building. So wherever we move, I mean, the notion of having any real autonomy in private space is becoming extremely challenged. And that means that if you have a very reactionary, right-wing, repressive government achieving control of some of these instruments of surveillance, the capacity for both supervision and control is much greater, I think, than at any other time in human history. There's also a politics of inequality and greed. I mean, politicians are rewarded on a basis not of how they can promote the common good, but how they can promote the welfare of the richest, and on a basis of that, kind of assume that, you know, the rest of us will benefit from some kind of trickle down. But there is a kind of a politics of inequality and greed associated with the whole neoliberal project, as public institutions are privatized, education and health and social welfare and prisons and goodness knows what, all aimed at accumulating and concentrating privilege in the private sector. It's also been accompanied since the World Trade Center by what I call the politics of fear, as the world confronts, you know, the so-called fear from international terrorism. I just want to mention here that, you know, I'm on the chair of a board that produces the Global Terrorism Index. Last year, there were 32,800 cases of terrorist violence, deaths from terrorism. 78% of those were in 5 countries: Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Libya, and Syria. So that is not a Western problem, even though there are attacks in France and there are lone wolf attacks in the United States. By and large, global terrorism is not a source of anxiety, should not be a source of anxiety to those of us living in the West. We succumb to that anxiety when we generate fear and fearfulness in response to that ostensible threat. But the politics of fear mean, as Faridi said in his book with the same name, that the left have forgotten the future they wish to realize, the right have forgotten the past they wish to preserve, and we're caught in a paralyzing presence, which generates the last politics I've got on the list there. Then in the last 10, 15 years as well, we've been subject to the politics of intervention and war. Even when as I've stated, most of the world's politics are not susceptible to coercive agency and coercive response, that hasn't stopped the West from intervening with disastrous consequences in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Libya and in Syria, with devastating and appalling consequences. The Chilcot report took a long time to come out, but now that it's out, it shows very clearly that war was a war of discretion rather than necessity, and it was a war that was based on fabrications. And that gives rise to another kind of politics, which is the politics of post-truthfulness. If you listen to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton yesterday, what you can say about Hillary, I'm not trying to be partisan here, although I really am, but Hillary didn't have any incorrect or untruthful statement in all of her comments. Trump made lying statements in almost every intervention he made. And the reality is that people accept those lies and as plain speaking in the American context. In Pennsylvania, the polls show 43.5 for Hillary, 43.5 for Trump. And so in a world of post-truth politics, you can get away with lies, which is exactly what Goebbels was talking about in the 1930s. I mean, it was a question of, you know, the biggest lie spoken often will generate fear, and that fear will generate obedience. And that's exactly what's happening. And then there's the politics of deficient and self-serving leadership. If you think about the world's leaders right now, who would you consider to be kind of, you know, able to sort of strut the global stage as a leader that was interested in the common good, in the promotion of the common good, in the promotion of global citizenship, in the promotion of a world order, in the promotion of a kind of a stable, peaceful, and just world? I mean, there are very few of those kinds of leaders around, which means that all of our politics are being driven by technocrats or by leaders whose eye is principally on a self-serving politics, which will guarantee their re-election. And if you look at what's happening in Europe, I mean, and these are just some of the drift whites in there from a year ago, so I apologize for that, but the Danish People's Party, this is Europe, what I call Europe's neo-fascism, is now polling 21%, 28% in the latest poll. The countries I don't have up there, the Swedish Progress Party is polling 14%. The Netherlands Freedom Party, 10 and rising. France National Front is rising from 14. Swiss People's Party is 29%. A third of the electorate are voting for basically a neo-fascist party. Alternatives for Germany are jumping mightily from this number here from 4.7 to 12 and 14% in the polls, and are going to give Angela Merkel a real run for her money. Austria's Freedom Party, which is completely neo-fascist, is 35%. Our Slovakia Party is 8%, and Hungary, the Jobbik Party, is 21% and rising. These are dangerous times. And the parties that have, it's very interesting, the parties that have been in favor of Donald Trump, was Geert Wilders in the Freedom Party. The National Front, Marie Le Pen said she was a Trump supporter. And in Hungary, Orbán said he too was a Trump supporter. Kim Jong-un in Korea said he is also a Trump supporter, as is Putin. So there is a kind of an alliance of reactionary, authoritarian, demagogic, populist, extremist, and xenophobic politicians who have, if not a formal alliance, at least a kind of informal coalition of interests. And so we've got, I think, a kind of a drift to the extremes, which I think is challenging to all of us. In Austria, for the first time since the Second World War, neither of Austria's two main centrist parties made it to the presidential runoff. It was the far right and the Greens fortunately won by a whisker. Denmark's party relies on the support of the Nationalist Danish Peaceful Party and has got the toughest immigration rules in Europe. The leader of the Nationalist Finns party is Foreign Minister of Finland after it joined the coalition government last year, and he's also moving Finland in a very reactionary direction. Anti-refugee, anti-Muslim, keeping Europe white, Protestant or Catholic, and European. And in France, the far-right National Front won 6.8 million votes in regional elections last year, in its largest ever score. And the far-right Jobbik Party in Hungary organizes patrols by an unarmed but uniformed Hungarian guard in Roma gypsy neighborhoods, echoes of the Second World War. Donald Trump, I think, is a classic political dominator. I just can't understand how he's getting so much coverage in the polls. Closer to home is Duterte, who won the Philippines presidency and has now presided over a 3-month period of rule where over 3,000 people have been given a license to kill. He campaigned on that. He said jokingly, I will fill Manila Bay with drug dealers, and there are 3,000 of them already dead. I mean, so where are the protests from around the world in relation to this slaughter? I mean, this is like a little war in Manila and Davao and other parts of the country. And we're sitting here in New Zealand, communicating with them. I mean, our Prime Minister, had a long conversation with Duterte at the G20 meeting, at the NASEAN meeting. And in Egypt, the person who crushed the Muslim Brotherhood is a populist dominator there. So we've got authoritarian drivers of domination, and the argument is that there are some active and passive authoritarian personality types. Donald Trump is a good example of an active authoritarian who arouses latent authoritarian tendencies in people who have little or no control over their own lives. A lot of the supporters of Trump are people who are marginalized, who have been unemployed or underemployed or in casual labor or doing a lot of piecework and so forth. And he says, follow me as an authoritarian leader, and you will gain back the authority that you've lost in the neoliberal world that we live in. And he does it with a violent rhetoric that generates an illusion of authoritarian response to physical, psychological threat and social change. He prioritizes social order and hierarchy to control a chaotic world. And this homogeneous Trumpian world is critical of diversity and blames outsiders, Muslims, Mexicans, Chinese, and women for upsetting an ordered past that's never existed. And the same thing happens all around the world. I mean, maybe the closest to New Zealand is Winston Peters, although he doesn't do all of that. But he's quite happy to play the race card when and as he thinks it might generate some kind of political support. But this dominatory politics, this drift right, this authoritarian politics doesn't work in an interdependent world. I mean, this is not the world of 1918. It's not the world of 1914 or 16. It's not the world of 1939. We are too closely interconnected, economically, politically, and in terms of communications and transport and so forth, for any of this kind of nationalist populism to work. And yet there are nationalist sentiments and nationalist movements emerging everywhere. And there is absolutely no evidence that zero-sum dominatory coercive politics will solve any of the complex problems confronting the world. It won't solve climate change. It won't solve inequality. It won't solve all of the problems of pollution. It won't solve all of the problems of marginality and exclusion. It doesn't deliver welfare. It doesn't deliver education. It doesn't deliver all of the things that make for a good and healthy life. On the contrary, there's a lot of evidence that they're incapable, these kinds of politics are incapable of solving complex problems. And they've generated very negative and pathological outcomes for citizens. So how do we move from what we might call dominatory to collaborative power? How do we get a genuine paradigm shift from a political paradigm based on power over others to one that's based on power with others? Or in Ken Boulding's terms, from coercive power to integrative power. How do we develop a value and normative system capable of sustaining an egalitarian, relatively non-coercive, non-dominatory social system and a politics to go with it? One of my big anxieties, Brexit was my first nightmare, but one of my big anxieties is that many of the achievements of the 20th century are being rolled back in the 21st century on the human rights front, on issues like capital punishment, and on issues around kind of hierarchy, wealth, power, and privilege. So my argument is that, in a way, we have to kind of begin reclaiming the power of the social, the power of the community, the power that exists in each one of our own lives and in each one of the relationships that we build with each other. So it seems to me that, that the alternative exists, but it's been systematically isolated and marginalized from the realm of political. It was Maggie Thatcher who said, society doesn't exist. There is no such thing as society. It's all politics and market. But the reality is that there is a norm that holds communities and societies together. It provides a sociological basis for continuity through time. And without it, political systems would have to depend almost completely on force and coercion. And it's the norm of reciprocity. So back to Alvin Goulder's 1960 norm of reciprocity. It's funny, I was in the class just before the lecture today, and students were complaining about a book I had assigned from 1985, and I really feel bad about sort of promoting something from 1960. It sort of sounds like the 19th century all over again. Anyway, Goulder argued that almost all societies endorse some form of the reciprocity norm. It lies at the heart of sociality and social life and being, and that only a few members are exempt from it, the young, the very young, the sick, and the old. And this norm regulates the exchanges of goods and services between people in ongoing group and individual relationships, and it dictates that people should help those who've helped them, that people should not injure those who've helped them, and that legitimate penalties may be imposed on those who fail to reciprocate. So it really is a sociological statement of the golden rule. And we've lost it, which is that, if we do unto others you happen to do unto you, you're practicing the norm of reciprocity. And it lies at the heart of good relationships, it lies at the heart of good society, it lies at the heart of thriving and resilient community. And without it, we're all lost. And this is in a kind of curious way where the left and the right come together. It seems to me that, to some extent, the one way in which we deal with the repressive politics, dominatory politics, and the pathological politics that I'm talking about is by rediscovering the power of association, the power that lies within each one of us as we forge relationships with each other and as we do what we have to do to satisfy each other's basic human needs for recognition, for security, and welfare. So the reciprocity norm, I think, is critical to social and political functioning and social and political stability through time. It's much more important than imposed political order. It's the glue that governs the millions of exchanges that take place every day, most of which have got nothing to do with the realm of politics. During the course of my day, none of Wellington's decisions have affected my behavior. It all rests on something else. It rests on, my commitment to students, my commitment to staff, my commitment to the university, my commitment to this town and this city and this province. That's much more important. And what I do makes some difference there. A small difference. And what we all do makes a difference to that whole. This norm generates altruism among kin and non-kin group. It limits selfishness. It challenges cheaters, freeloaders, and dominators, and creates the sociological and social psychological basis for integration and harmony, both of which have almost nothing to do with the state. And so when politicians keep on telling us that, our future, our harmony and so forth depends on their activities, we have to say to them, as a matter of fact, no. Your power depends on our society and our community and our relationships and our individual capacities and our individual powerfulness. If the consumer is sovereign in the market, then we are sovereign in the polity. And our politicians forget that. They forget that they are our servants and not the other way around. We're not their servants, they are our servants. That's why the whole notion of public service came into play. And that's why the notion of public service now being displaced is such a kind of a challenge to society and community. And that gives rise to the basis for dominatory politics, where it's assumed that we are of no consequence except at election time, where our interests are not there to be served, that it's the interests of the state that need to be served. And the assumption is that if the economy is doing well and the state is doing well, then somehow or other, we individual citizens will be doing very well, thank you very much. Well, the reality is that their capacity to do all that they do depends on our reciprocity with each other, the exchanges we have with each other on a daily basis from morning till night. So what is the politics of compassion? I mean, the easy answer is that it's the opposite of dominatory, pathological, fear-driven, xenophobic politics based on a monopoly of force and coercion. The difficult answer is that it's a new political paradigm for an interdependent world. It starts with compassionate leaders and ends with compassionate citizens in a more compassionate world. It could also start with compassionate citizens generating compassionate leaders and then for a more compassionate world. And that's the lovely thing about it. It's a politics that doesn't depend on our politicians giving us permission to be compassionate, that if the whole world were a little more compassionate at the level of locality, we would actually kind of start generating some momentum from the base upwards, and our politicians would be revealed very often what they are, emperors without clothes, doing things which we don't want done to us. It focuses on making social rather than economic and political criteria the major focus of political decision-making. So we ought to be applying, instead of not just doing kind of environmental impact reports and so we all need to be doing social impact reports on what is going to be the effect of X, Y, and Z economic policies and political policies on our ability to be reciprocal with each other, on our ability to be in positive relationship with each other, on our ability to be good self-actualized human beings. It aims at resolving problems non-violently, collaboratively, empathetically, and altruistically, and they sort of trip off my tongue easily, and it looks like as though this is the Peace Research Center as opposed to the politics department. But I mean, these are challenging processes. How do we do non-violent politics? How do we ensure that we kind of collaborate and cooperate more than compete and divide? How do we make sure that our politics is empathetic? How do I, and this is the big challenge, how do I sit and watch Donald Trump and kind of try and understand the inner Donald? Because presumably in there is a kind of a human being and an aspiration that's sort of similar to all of us that we might be able to connect with. But so how do we begin this kind of consciousness of others, even the negative others who we know might harm us? And the politics of compassion is inclusive rather than exclusive. It's egalitarian rather than hierarchical. And it rests on relationships instead of domination. So what would compassionate leadership look like? I mean, it's a leadership that's built on transparent and open communications aimed at establishing harmlessness to others and maximal levels of trust. So which of our political leaders are transparent and open and harmless to us? The reality is that I feel frightened by a number of our political leaders. They do things which we all know to be inimical to our interests. And if you're living in the Philippines and you have a president that's creating a permissive environment, they're going to do harm to you. Innocent people will be killed. Drone warfare is also something that generates, harmfulness to others. When President Obama checks the target list each day for who should be taken out in the global war on terror, he's creating harm to others. and innocent civilians are being killed in extrajudicial executions by the country that's supposed to be driven by the rule of law. Compassionate leadership is flexible and adaptable, willing to set aside rules, regulations, and traditions for the greater good. So trying to think about how you can do a politics that really is aimed at building the common good, building positive relationships at the level of locality and between state and citizen. It's emotionally intelligent, taking account of the needs, hopes, and fears of others and seeking to satisfy them, instead of fomenting them. I mean, when our politicians say, we've really got to put up our borders and we've got to get strict with customs and immigration and we've got to, maintain the integrity of New Zealand against all those who might wish to come here and so forth. I mean, it generates a fear which is not necessary and is unhelpful in terms of thinking through a different kind of politics. It leads by example rather than by direction. Instead of just changing legislation to suit the interests of the state or to suit the interests of interest groups, what would happen if our politicians started really leading by example? And what would happen if instead of looking at kind of negative sanctions, we had more positive inducements and rewards to people? What would happen if we were all rewarded for kind of random acts of loving kindness? And you can see some of this happening when when that dreadful TV show, what is it? It's Seven Sharp gets on there, and they have a good sort. I mean, and somebody's rewarded for altruistic behavior. I mean, that's the kind of thing which needs more positive recognition. We all need to be kind of acknowledging those who are doing altruistic, selfless things to keep the community together. And it's focused on consequences and consciousness of the effects that words and actions have on others. I mean, Hillary was right to say to Trump last night that words are important. They have consequences. So what does the practice of kindness and compassion do for organizations and politics? There's a whole new literature coming up on this, which I think is really interesting. If you're practicing kindness and compassion in political process or in organizations, I mean, like the university, for example, it would increase people's capacity for empathy and compassion. As we go through what we call the management of change at the University of Otago, I mean, where is the empathy and compassion for those who are getting the pink slips and having to reapply for their jobs? Where was the incentive to do the cooperative work that the English department's doing in response to the need to get rid of one or two members of its staff? Some of the leadership is encouraging competition between faculty as they all apply for the same jobs again instead of stimulating cooperation. So this is not what a kind of compassionate politics would do at the organizational setting of the University of Canterbury. It would promote positive relationships. So we could solve our entire university's debt problem by all of us taking a 1% cut in salary. Noble thought. We could do it for 3 years and then see what happens. But that wasn't put on the table, and none of us were asked to discuss that. But that would be compassionate politics in action. It decreases the prevalence of toxic negative emotions and behavior. So instead of blaming the Mexicans, the Chinese, and everyone else, as Trump does and as Orban does in Hungary, it would say, let's think about, what can we gain from Syrians? What can we learn from Syrians? What resources are they bringing to our polity and our society? It increases optimism and hope, and it builds resilience and energy levels, and it counteracts the negative effects of judgment and bias. I mean, so if it does that in organizations, and there's a lot of evidence that it does, then what would happen if you started doing this at the level of politics? Of course, some of you will then say, well, I'm just a kind of a naive idealist here, that politics is all about power control and a monopoly of force, which of course it is. But that's no reason why we shouldn't begin trying to change it, so that kind of monopoly of force is only ever used as a dramatic last resort, and that we build kind of processes and dynamics which mean that you don't have to reveal the iron fist beneath the velvet glove of welfare, education, and so forth, except on the rarest of occasions. So compassionate, in terms of compassionate processes, respect and caring is critical to compassion. What would the world look like if political leaders were psychologically and socially curious, empathetic, and respectful? What would it look like if there was a kind of the sorts of things that happened in Bellamy's took place in the House of Parliament itself? and there was a willingness to kind of collaborate together to solve problems, rather than to kind of compete with each other to score political points. What would happen if we put the needs of others before our own in Levinas's terms, take unconditional responsibility for the welfare of others except when those others are causing harm or suffering, in which case we have to stop the suffering. And compassion is loving kindness in action. Now, the moment you mention that, people would say, well, this is completely for the birds in terms of politics. What's politics got to do with loving kindness? Well, the reality is that if our politicians were really attuned to the citizens they represent, and if they were kind of motivated by a desire to kind of be loving and caring and kind and compassionate, they actually would take a little bit more time to sort of consult, to negotiate with, to try and determine some local level responses to national level problems. We ignore, with our, 106 members of parliament or whatever it is, we ignore the 4.5 million others, who are not in parliament. How do we liberate collective imagination in response to a solution of national problems? And in all of this, compassion pays particular attention to health, education, and welfare, which are key to life and societal happiness. So these are not optional extras. These are not to be tampered with. These are to be nurtured, encouraged, and stimulated as a public good, as a public service, as a way of guaranteeing that we can do our own business of kind of, connecting with each other on a reciprocal basis as we do every day of our lives. So if you look at compassionate and empathetic leaders, this is a very challenging task. If I'd sort of given you a task right now, think of a compassionate leader. It sort of seems like a complete oxymoron. But Pope Francis, I think, is a good example. He's somebody who's courageous. He sort of, he takes a whole plane to Athens and picks up a group of refugees as a symbolic act. He's not afraid to challenge the hierarchy. He's not afraid to live in, in very humble conditions in Rome. He's retained a kind of an empathetic consciousness. He's not perfect. Nobody is perfect, but he has a kind of he has that compassionate touch. The Dalai Lama clearly is. He's always sort of, practicing compassion and kindness. Gandhi was. King and Rosa Parks, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. Angela Merkel, I think she's a hardhead, but I think she's at heart a kind of a softie because, her father was a Lutheran minister. And I think that underneath, there is that Lutheran compassion throbbing, waiting to get out. But, it's really interesting. And so who would you think of as compassionate, empathetic leaders in our own polity? Green politicians and some Labour politicians. Are our women politicians more empathetic and compassionate than our male politicians? How do we nurture, compassionate, empathetic leaders who can, through their own charisma and example, catalyze the good in all of us rather than pander to the fear? So what's to be done and where do we begin? I think we first of all have to analyze and negate dominatory politics everywhere. We in addition to conflict sensitivity and gender sensitivity and environmental sensitivity, we need political sensitivity. We need to be able to sniff out a dominatory politician or a dominatory individual, and we need to challenge that person and ask, what's the point of your domination? Where does it end, and what are the goods that are going to flow from that? It means acknowledging the political and the personal and the social. This is the difference between small p and big P politics. If we can't practice compassionate politics in our personal relationships, then how can we do it at the national level? So how do we do this? How do we, and all of us, I don't practice compassionate politics at a personal level all the time. I'm always blundering in and making mistakes, and we all do. But then how do we make sure that we're kind of, that we're practicing nonviolent communication, that we're practicing deep listening, that we're kind of understanding what the other needs and so forth? And how do we identify and promote political leaders and political parties that are committed to the welfare and well-being of others in collaboration and discussion with those they wish to help? So in all of this work, we need to begin focusing our attention on who are the people in New Zealand, for example, that are uniting us rather than dividing us, the unifiers rather than the dividers. Who are the people that are the good integrators? Who are the people that are actually kind of interested in the public good in terms of health and welfare and education? And how do we promote those people? And how do we celebrate them? And how do we turn them into heroes and sheroes, which is, I found out, is the feminine equivalent of a hero. Another part of this has to do with equality and inclusion. I mean, we can't do any of this in hierarchical institutions. In this institution, I mean, I may have some power as professor. I'm no longer, there's no such thing as a God professor anymore, but I don't have as much power as the vice chancellor or the pro-vice chancellor or the deputy vice chancellors. I mean, what would the university look like if we were all fellows? It's a radical thought, isn't it? There was no distinction that, all the teaching faculty were fellows, and some were paid more or less, but by and large, we were all fellows. And including women as the fellows as well. But we're all fellows. What would it mean in terms of our desire to kind of serve the public good? And yet all of the incentives in the university are aimed towards glittering prizes for individuals. PBRF rankings and so forth are critical to our well-being and the future well-being of the university. And so the university is a Darwinian environment which rewards the individual, and the collective is imperiled. So I think we've got to radically critique the way in which our governmental and non-governmental processes reduce and reproduce patterns of hierarchy, power, and privilege. Because in the end, you can only support those coercively, with police or with the military or whatever. It means we give priority to the weakest and the poorest and place welfare, education, and health at the heart of state activity. These are not option extras. These are critical to the state function. There are 4 functions, of the state. Maybe in national security, but education, health, and welfare are critical to well-being. And they should be claims on the public purse, and we should all be highly satisfied with the way in which our taxes are spent on those things. And how do we identify and reinforce individuals and groups who sustain the social fabric in the face of economic and political subversion? All of this involves, what I might call deep contextual analysis. How do we go with the grain of locality? Far too much of our analysis and prescription remains global, abstracted, and detached. So, in every place we find ourselves, we need to know who internally and externally wields power and who's subjugated. Who unites and who divides? Who supports the status quo and who's challenging it? Who's analyzing and who's being analyzed? Where do we stand and sit, and how do we mobilize across intersectional lines and build empathetic spaces across the boundaries of difference in New Zealand? You can see exactly what's happening in New Zealand right now. There's a kind of bicultural divide. There's a multicultural, there are multicultural divides occurring as well now with Indians and Chinese communities. How are we going to finesse all of this, the bicultural, the multicultural, in the New Zealand of the 21st century? It's going to require enormous sensitivity, enormous empathy, and an ability to cross these fundamental cultural, political, linguistic divides, which are part of Aotearoa New Zealand in the 21st century. And we've got to develop inclusive and participatory processes. These didn't occur in 1914 when Archie Baxter and others were making their decisions. Everything was from the king downwards, king and country and prime minister downwards, and citizens were expected to obey authority. But how do we develop processes that do justice to the concrete experience of those who are victims of domination, violence, marginalization, humiliation? How can we do this without transforming ourselves in less domineering, nonviolent, inclusive ways? And how do we do all of this when dependent on governments perpetuating negative politics and wedded to power, force, and coercion? So compassionate politics, above all else, is nonviolent politics. It stands in opposition to that Weberian notion of the state as the monopoly of force and power. Now, you may say we need force and power, and I'm prepared to concede that on some occasions, there may be an occasion when some force has to be utilized to maintain order, but we don't need it most of the time, because most of the time, most of us are peaceful. That's the whole point about the norm of reciprocity. It means that most of us are peaceful most of the time. Ken Boulding used to say, there's nothing you can do with a clenched fist. We can't make things, you can't knit, you can't write, you can't type with a clenched fist. So most of us are nonviolent and peaceable. And we're nonviolent and peaceable because we know it's in our interest to be that way, and we're nonviolent and peaceable because of the norm of reciprocity. We know that if we do good to others, they'll do good to us, and somehow or other that will result in our survival through time. So, compassionate politics and compassionate practice. Got to focus on micro, meso, and macro ways in which domination and dependence are institutionalized. We've got to widen the focus from formal politics to public and private politics and aim for some consistency between them. The personal is political, and the political is personal. We've got to rediscover the values of empathetic, altruistic, collaborative processes in a world dedicated to its opposite. And we've got to focus on inclusive, elicitive, iterative, cumulative dynamics that build peace one step at a time. And that way, I think, we'll kind of generate the capacity for individual resistance when individual resistance is needed. And that way, I think we can also generate a capacity for an empowering politics that's based on the society and the community rather than on the state. And I always finish with John Paul Lederach's pocket mantra. I mean, we have to figure out ways to reach out to those we fear, including those who might wish to harm us. We've got to figure out ways of relating to them because they're part of our web of connections and interconnections and relationships. We can't exclude ourselves from them, we can't cut ourselves off from them. So we have to reach out to those we fear and all that we fear and embrace it in some way so that it may be transformed and so that we don't have to end up with a slaughter like occurred in the Somme and during the Second World War. Secondly, we have to move beyond simplistic dualisms and touch the heart of complexity. How do we do that? I mean, that's a kind of a critical thing for all of us to do. I mean, we individual human beings are complex organisms alone. Just think how much more complex we are together. And how do we kind of begin understanding that complexity and holding it in a sort of a frame which is generative and which liberates imagination. And that the third thing is, how do we imagine what's seen? I mean, without a vision, the people perish. And without a vision, we're all certainly lost. So how do we imagine beyond what's seen? And in all of this, how do we be courageous in the face of things which might challenge our courage? How do we risk vulnerability one step at a time? And my answer to that is, we have to begin realizing the power that lies within each one of us to be the autonomous, self-actualizing individuals that we are in community with others. And in that process of communal solidarity, we'll discover a politics that will enable us to resist authority when authority has to be resisted. Thanks, that's it.
Indeed, Kevin. That was absolutely splendid. And
good.
Most certainly did justice to Archie's stand of looking beyond the present towards the greater good when he stood up against it. And he didn't criticize the people who were tying him to the post, but he realized that they were part of a machine. And it was the machine that he was objecting to. Yeah, I think at a very tiny level, something that happened, I think it was perhaps a bit earlier on this year, Prof. Blakey was talking about the use of language at the University of Otago. And I'm conscious that when I read in the ODT that a judge maybe, or somebody who's carrying out a coroner's report slams the police, or his report hits out at such and such a group. And the sort of language that we get and the impressions that we get when that sort of language is used makes it okay, perhaps, to be violent. And Prof. Blakey is leading a charge at the moment, even the word charge. He's leading the cause, if you will, about non-violent language at the university, which I think will also help. However, Prof. Clements has agreed to answer some questions, and so we've got probably 20 minutes if people would like to say anything, ask anything. And I'd ask you, because we're recording this, and it will be put on iTunes U in due course, as last year's lecture has been, then please use this microphone and I'll bring it to you. Yes. Here you go, pass along, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Kevin. Really thought-provoking. I want to challenge you, if that's all right.
That's absolutely fine.
I want to challenge how you're managing to pull together your narratives on compassionate politics with your de facto support of Hillary Clinton, one of the greatest warmongers of the last 10 years, who's been a vital part of the drone strikes programs that you've been talking about, and a huge part of Obama's destructive politics. Is she not actually a prime example of a passive authoritarian figure who is not hiding behind lies, but hiding behind the words that are trying to, I suppose, make those lies visible? And if anything, in our acceptance of that binary of Trump and Clinton, are we not actually living by that same politics of fear that you suggest that we need to avoid?
Challenging question, Kieran. Well, this is one of the big challenges facing the United States right now. I mean, both candidates, I think, are flawed in different ways. And as Kieran said, there's no doubt at all that Hillary Clinton his nature is to be a bit of a hawk rather than a dove on foreign policy. More than a bit. I mean, she's certainly a hawk on foreign policy. The question is whether or not she's going to be more of a dove on integration and social relationships and ethnic relationships and all the other things. And I have a feeling that she might be, and she ought to be, and she should be. But I mean, it is a challenge. I mean, I think Trump is the worst of two evils in this instance. I'm not a great Hillary supporter, but if I were in the United States, I think I'd have to vote for her. And it would be a nervous vote because, as you say, I mean, I think her instincts are to use power when she needs to. I was shocked when Bill Clinton was campaigning for presidency and ordered the execution of that person the person in Arkansas had a mental retardation and issue, and he ordered his execution to demonstrate that he had balls, basically. And Hillary, I'm sure, is not averse to demonstrating that she's a strong woman as well, strong political leader as well. So it's a challenge, and in a way, my argument would probably apply equally against both of them. I mean, you're quite right. The logic of it would be to say that I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter at heart, but he didn't get the nomination.
Prof, it's good to see that you still have it and you can keep us alive for 40 minutes without any distraction. My real question is, when will we start to see our lecturing staff, our professorial staff, come back into the union and get our students as excited as you have got us here tonight? The main common room, when we were at varsity, was full of people like yourself who would wind us up and turn us on and have us excited and interested. We don't see them anymore. Our lecturers appear to be fearful and hidden. What you've just delivered to us is gold. Our students deserve it. When will we see you back in the main common room?
Right. I'm happy to be in the main common room. I mean, it is a very interesting challenge. I mean, when I was at university, the universities were havens for eccentrics. There were some people who could teach and not do research. There were some people who could neither teach nor do research, but who came up with a brilliant idea every now and again. There were some who were completely dysfunctional in normal life, but were able to animate a conversation. Lots of them would never have got appointed to the modern university. I think that's a challenge. I mean, I think our universities are becoming homogenized. I think that the corporate culture has taken over. I think that we're trying to generate. I think I feel more and more that we're an academic proletariat, churning out education for customers rather than students, and I think that's a challenge.
So you're saying that if you were to receive an education currently that the main common room you might see?
Oh, happy to do that. Yeah.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I really liked your challenge to bring compassion into politics and to look at how we can, reach out to others and share that compassion and maybe bring that encourage that community aspect. I guess for all of us in that room, of course, that's something that we're looking to do and would want to do and would want to extend to those outside of here. I guess in a number of countries, where I come from in Australia, there's increasing, I guess, increasing towards exclusion and things like that, a growing vote within the Australian political system, unfortunately. How do you think we go about reaching outside perhaps the educated academia or those willing or knowing about, some of the things that we're aware of in this room, and how do we reach beyond our own, collective here to encourage, compassion and a different way of functioning politically?
Well, I think we need a kind of a different kind of politics. We need a politics of we need a proactive, creative, imaginative politics which is setting agendas, and we need a politics of resistance to those that are moving in a reactionary, dominatory, xenophobic, intolerant direction. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now. The reason, if I had to choose between Trump and Clinton, is because Clinton is not pandering to a culture of fear or to xenophobia or to intolerance. She's not doing that, even if she is a hawk on the other side. And for that, I think we need to reward her, because if we lapse to the lowest common denominator and all of America's problems are laid at the feet of the Chinese or the Mexicans or the Muslims or whatever, then I think we're in very dangerous areas. So we've got to have a politics which is proactive, imaginative, and creative. We have to have a politics which does much more listening rather than talking. We have to have a politics which is future-oriented, and we have to have a politics which is capable of resisting those who would seek to use and manipulate state systems for private purpose.
I wonder in some ways if chickens aren't coming home to roost. I was watched a DVD about Harry Belafonte, an American politician, not a political politician, but an entertainer who was part of the civil rights movement. And he was talking about his life about 2011. And we talked about King and how Robert Kennedy changed before he was assassinated. But he also talked about where the United States was. And he said, and he didn't end up talking about racial politics. He ended up talking about some other kind of politics. He said it would become a crime to be poor in America. They have more people in prison than any other country per capita in the world. In fact, they have more people in prison. And this happened it got worse under the Clinton years, 3 strikes and you're out. And we say that we have to challenge an economic system that, for instance, labor supported in the 80s, that is not compassionate. It's the opposite, neoliberalism. And we have to actually question, and not so much fear in who we choose to vote for and who we choose to lead us. People say that you can't support Jeremy Corbyn because he's weak, because he's a nice guy, he's gentle, but he's weak. He can never bring victory. Where do you go from there? That's the people that supported Blair. And in America, the same thing happened. But it's interesting, Jerry Corbyn, he got 62% of the Labour Party vote. And everybody, his vote increased. We have to show more courage and imagination in our politics.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Joanna Macy of Death and Dying fame has, at the age of 86, has been kind of arguing in the last year that we're at the end of the industrial growth model. It's reached its end. The neoliberal project is over. That the whole world's financial system is very precarious. The Bank of International Settlements and reserve banks don't know whether they have the capacity to kind of respond to another global financial crisis, for example. So we're in a situation where she says that model is at an end. And what that's generating is what she calls the great unraveling. So there is an unraveling of the political process, and indeed the whole the Western democratic project, I think, is at risk. Because if all of those majorities that I talked about in Europe became majorities, you would have a fascist Europe, and a highly intolerant Europe, and a Europe that was inimical to kind of public welfare, public goods, hospitality to foreigners, et cetera, et cetera. So the great unraveling is an incentive, therefore, to us to kind of think about what a new turning might be. What would a new world look like? What would new politics look like? We've got to think beyond the old 19th century left-right politics towards a politics which makes sense of the human condition. I mean, I can't understand what sort of a world we're entering right now. I mean, our one-year-old grandson this week, came and took my iPhone, which I thought was locked, but he was able to kind of go flip, 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 and then he was in the camera mode. I mean, and he already knew how to do it at the age of 1. So what's going to happen with this whole generation, which is sort of technologically advanced, so advanced that they'll kind of put us all to shame? And so where is that world of technology going to take us? And what's it going to do to that basic norm of reciprocity and the law of association and community? We had a dance for my party the other night, and a number of my students said they'd never been to a dance before. I mean, this is appalling. I think it's appalling. I mean, they go to discos and things like that, but they've never been to a dance before. It's certainly not a barn dance. I mean, so what does that mean? I mean, if and people aren't singing anymore. So if there's no singing and no dancing, what's happening to the world? There's something that, we are unraveled in all sorts of terrible ways. So this is an opportunity, it seems to me, for us to begin thinking creatively and imaginatively about something which transcends the old left-right politics, but which is progressive, that will address the collapse of one order. The thing which worries me at the moment is this whole resurgence of China, is that they seem like the last gasp of a dying order to thinking that there is still another puff of breath in neoliberalism, as they literally choke themselves to death. I mean, respiratory illnesses kill 1 million people a year in China. So what's happening to the world? I mean, this is not going to last. And so it seems to me that we've got to really begin thinking of, how do we address that great unraveling? What kind of synergies and creative opportunities can we kind of devise to sort of begin a process of re-engagement with the things which enable us to really survive through time?
Thank you. It seems to me that I have a very bright, techie, savvy nephew who is using technology extremely creatively to provide healthcare in remote parts of Africa where otherwise women and children would be dying without very competent use of mobile phones, etc. And his thesis is that local government is always more healthy than national government, because local governments actually live with the reality of the reciprocal relationships and the actual real needs. South Dunedin floods, someone has to do something. It's not Mr. Key who has to do it.
No, it's not.
It's and the positive, the big positives in New Zealand history, from my perspective, things like the nuclear free movement started at local government level. Town by town will become nuclear free. And while Obama is planning to spend vast sums modernising the nuclear weapons, the coalition of mayors in the United States are saying, let us get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. So we have a divide somehow between the local level, where reciprocity, as you say, operates and always has done since we climbed down out of the trees, because it's the only way we survived, and then national politics, which somehow get separated from that and can behave in much more irrational and destructive ways.
Yeah.
Do you see a way of somehow getting our national politics closer to our local level politics?
Well, I agree with you completely. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, and this is always a bit of a challenge. If you lurch into the unknown of local politics and you know, kind of provincial revival or whatever it might be in the New Zealand context, I mean, there's always this anxiety about what will it really mean? Is it going to succeed, or is it going to be I think there's somebody right here, Alan. There's right there. Yeah. Oh. So the question is, how do we work at locality to create you know, movements which you know, become irresistible at the level of central government? You know, so that's why these local government elections are important. You know, they do have consequences, and I'm pleased that the mayors were able to ensure that you know, there was not going to be any major change to the Local Governments Act, so that, you know, there'd be more appointed members of local government authorities and things. I mean, the university councils have been gutted by you know, removing a lot of the elected people on them and replacing with government appointees. It's not a good move.
I've jotted down some remarks while you were talking, and I think one of the first things we should do to solve problems is analyze the problems correctly. Sure. And so I was surprised when you said the Brexit, you considered it to be a nightmare, where I consider it to be the light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, you do?
Because at some point you lamented the fact that there's no leaders anymore, and certainly no compassionate leaders, but only technocrats. But the European Union is the prime example of technocracy. And I'm happy it's starting to unravel now. And Brexit is one of the key elements in that process. And you were talking about finding global solutions to problems. And I think what we have seen is that globalism has mainly caused the problems and has not offered any solutions. All the global institutions that have arisen in the past, let's say, 50 years, like the European Union, have been problem makers rather than problem solvers. And so I think that, on the contrary, we need more nationalism. We should go back to a more restrained setting, a more local level, try to solve the problems from bottom up instead from top down. And yeah, that's mainly the remark I wanted to make.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, my position on Brexit is that even with all of its faults, it has managed to keep the peace in Europe for the last, you know, 70-odd years, and more importantly, it has created a kind of a pan-European consciousness, you know, which I think is important. So I'm not in favor of retreating from, you know, kind of regional and a kind of a human consciousness or a planetary consciousness even, back into a reassertion of nationalism and worse, tribalism. So I think, and I see those dynamics as different from local level contextualized politics which are making sense of locality. I mean, I think that the two can coexist, but there's no reason why your local level politics shouldn't be informed by a regional and a global consciousness of wider responsibilities than the responsibilities that exist at the level of locality. I mean, New Zealand right now is, Dunedin right now is, you know, projecting itself as a global gigabyte city or whatever it is, or a city of literature, et cetera, et cetera. And its orientation is to make sure that this little place has a place in the world. You know, so for me, there's this terrible tension between identities that fit and suit us, but which are permeable enough to regional and global kind of responsibility and consciousness. I mean, and this is a big challenge. It's a balancing act, but I mean, how do we do it? How do we maintain the identities of locality while retaining a cosmopolitan consciousness?
Thank you. My question relates to your degree of optimism. I found your lecture very stimulating and very interesting, and I feel moved by it and enthusiastic and all of those things. I wonder, how optimistic are you about the likelihood of something like this happening?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think it's important that anybody that's doing peace and justice work or human rights work, retains their optimism, because there's much to generate despair. So for me, another kind of part of this whole movement towards compassionate politics is to be optimistic that we may prevail. I mean, who thought that the labor movement would prevail in the 19th century? Who thought that the women's movement would prevail in the 20th century? Who thought the human rights movement would come to fruition? These came from ideas of passionate people who gathered with others and who generated a momentum that proved to be irresistible. And I think that's the challenge for all of us, which is, how do we generate movement? How do we generate ideas which capture others' imaginations, which enable us to kind of work with others in collectivizing that imagination, and then ensuring that there's sort of mobilization around it to sort of realize that imagination. That's the challenge. So I'm not saying it's going to be fast. I don't think you can develop a new paradigm to old political paradigms, especially not when there is I think there is an instinct to re-tribalize, and I think that's dangerous. But I think that it's really important that we begin living alternative paradigms.
And probably one of the best ways to do that is on your own doorstep when talking to neighbours and friends.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm going to draw the discussion to a close now, but I'd like you to join me in thanking one more time Kevin for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.